Modern truck engines are a far cry from old workhorses that were reliable, simple, and cheap to make. Nowadays, finding a good truck engine is like searching for a needle in a haystack. And to make matters worse, it's much easier to make the mistake of buying a bad and unreliable engine instead of something that will keep your truck on the road for years on end. We're here to prevent you from making such a mistake as we take you through the absolute worst engines in terms of reliability and quality, according to Consumer Reports. Let's first start with one of the newest units, which is the Hurricane Straight 6 from the Ram 1500. There's no avoiding it. This engine is a massive letdown. And how couldn't it be? It's a straight 6, and it has been brought to replace the well-adored Hemi Fiv 8. Now, don't get us wrong. We love ourselves a good straight 6. However, the Hurricane is the exact opposite to that. First, this engine is still very new to the market, and as such remains relatively unproven. Now, this wouldn't be that big of an issue if this weren't Stellantis we're talking about. Their quality control has been non-existent ever since FCA and PSA merged, and we honestly never would put our trust on their own in-house made and designed engines. Not to mention that all new designs have problems in the first few years, and the Hurricane 6 will certainly not be an exception in this regard. Even though it's a new unit, Stellantis' Straight 6 has already started showing its ugly head on a great many aspects. First, because it's an overcomplicated design, doing any work on it will be a nightmare and very time-consuming, which, in turn, translates to expensive services. On some occasions, the entire body will have to be removed for the mechanic to access an arbitrary part, which, you'll agree, isn't convenient. Additionally, this is, after all, a twin-turbo engine, and that comes with its own set of demons. Intercoolers, hoses, additional wiring, additional software and hardware stuff, all of which constantly bring in new failure points to the Hurricane 6 that makes it not that ideal for work. Plus, because of the extreme pressure it will be going through, no matter how well built it is, a 3.0-liter straight 6 of this caliber will never be able to compete, let alone beat a powerhouse like a Hemi Fiv 8 in terms of reliability and longevity, which has been built to withstand hundreds of thousands of miles with only regular service and minor fixes. And even then, despite it having an increased power and torque output compared to the Hemi Fiv 8, the Hurricane 6 remains one of the least potent flagship engines on offer in terms of towing, having drastically less towing capacity than the rivaling 3.5-liter EcoBoost Fi 6. Plus, the reception to it has been so poor that despite massive updates to the interior and exterior, the new Ram 1500 has seen a massive sales drop during the previous year, with around 20% less people buying it than before. The issue with the Hurricane Straight 6 engine is so severe that other Stellantis products that have originally adopted it instead of a V8, such as the new Dodge Charger, are reportedly getting their V8s back, despite Stellantis' push towards downsizing. But the thing is, Stellantis isn't the only one that has had an issue of this sort. In fact, even some of the most respectable car manufacturers out there have had drastic issues with their turbocharged truck engines, with the most glaring example being Toyota. After the Tundra's redesign, many of us were disappointed that that dinosaur of a V8, which is colloquially regarded as one of the best engines ever to be made, was replaced by a 3.4-liter twin-turbo V6. However, that wasn't even the beginning of our agony, because everyone expected Toyota to know how to make a reliable engine. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, as the V6 engine was riddled with catastrophic issues. Ever since it was brought to the market, owners started complaining about minor gripes and issues, and the engine proved lacking compared to other Toyota power plants in terms of reliability. Minor gremlins, some lesser reliability problems, and other small but irritating issues have been a common sight. However, those issues wouldn't be enough to call this engine the worst there is. However, the fact that it tends to occasionally grenade itself without any prior notice more than certainly does contribute to the title we've given it. You see, recently, over 100,000 vehicles that utilized this engine had to be recalled because engines kept getting totaled from time to time. The result of this, on closer inspection, was machining debris, which could lead to engine knocking, not being able to start, or just dying altogether mid-drive. And in a modern truck, which relies mostly on electricity, losing engine power equals to losing all control. And despite the engine being fixed now, there still are more than a couple of issues. First, real-world MPG is terrible, with many people saying it lingers on to the low tens, which is terrible for such a small engine. Second, it really doesn't offer peace of mind in terms of capability, as despite having 390 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque, the Tundra can only tow up to 12,000 pounds, a whole 2,000 pounds, than Ford's EcoBoost 3.5-liter engine, which Toyota practically copied. Now, this is especially depressing when you take into consideration that you get all this mediocrity with an engine that's just as, or even more complicated than the Hurricane 6, which is really a terrible shame. Finally, the engine itself doesn't really run smooth. It's got a boring sound, the power delivery isn't great for a twin-turbo engine, and you don't feel like you're driving a truck engine-wise. Honestly, as much as we love Toyota, we have to say that the 3.4-liter iForce V6 is such a fundamentally flawed engine that even if they managed to make it as reliable as possible, you'd only get an unremarkable and limitedly capable engine at best. Now, despite our general praise for Ford's 3.5-liter EcoBoost, its smaller brother, the 2.7-liter EcoBoost, isn't so lucky. Now, sure, this is a cracking engine in the beginning, and from new, you're sure to hear acres of praise being thrown at it. But once you start digging deeper, you'll see why this unit isn't just not good, but is a terrible choice for a long-term buyer, or even worse, a used truck buyer. First, let's address the elephant in the room. It's just overstrained for a full-size truck. It makes sense in the Ranger, in which it appears with the Lariat trim. However, the F-150's chassis is too heavy for a truck like that. It really offers nothing to the table compared to the 3.6-liter Pentastar V6 Stellantis uses, or the similar and better Turbo 4 used on GM trucks. It has only 310 horsepower, it can tow only up to 8,400 pounds, which is 1,200 less than the Silverado's four-cylinder, and it just isn't a good choice for a full-size pickup truck. Additionally, it, by design, has a couple of big issues, the biggest of which is the wet belt system. You see, instead of designing an engine like a normal company would and fitting it with a timing belt or timing chain, Ford decided to utilize a wet belt system, which means that the timing belt is constantly soaked in oil. This, theoretically, prolongs the belt's lifespan, with it being practically extended to the same level as a timing chain. However, in practice, what the wet belt system does is help degrade the belt faster. You see, if you use any other oil brand rather than the one that has been strictly instructed to be used, you can expect your belt to rapidly decompose, leading to engine failure, which is a costly fix. Yes, you heard us right. Brand, not type. It's the chemical composition that degrades the belt, and because most mechanics don't really use specified brands, you can see how this can grow to be an issue. The consensus for this engine is that if maintained meticulously and if lightly used, it can be a reliable unit. But honestly, nobody is buying a truck, especially not an entry-level truck, to take pristine care of it and baby it around. So, should you go for a new EcoBoost 2.7 V6? Well, if you intend on having a truck that won't really be used as one, and if you care for MPG, then yes, with good care, it will be a solid choice. But by God, don't get a used one, because those that have already been used and abused shouldn't be touched with a 10-foot pole. Personally, we'd just skip it and go for the Coyote 5.0 V8 or the 3.5-liter EcoBoost V6. Both are considerably better engines for long-term usage, with the 5.0 being our top pick for the best half-ton engine currently available. But let's not delve on the present and look at the past, because there are even worse engines than the ones we've just mentioned. In fact, one of those is the 5.0 Coyote's ancestor, the Ford Triton 5.4-liter V8. This engine, which is a derivative of the Ford modular platform, famously used in the Panther body family of cars, has been a real troublemaker for most of its owners, and it has garnered a terrible reputation, often being called the worst Ford V8 engine ever made. The first problem with the Triton is the fact that it has a small and weak timing chain, which translates to it stretching quite easily and quite rapidly. Now, a timing chain stretching will always be an expensive fix, but a timing chain issue on a V8 engine is sure to make you go bankrupt, especially if you're buying a vehicle that's old enough to have a Triton in it. Plus, it's not just the chain that's the problem. The crankshaft tends to lose synchronization with the camshaft, which usually leads to the pistons bending the valves and even leading to the entire engine just grenading itself completely. And if that wasn't enough, the Triton also has a problem with the spark plugs. The Triton has a problem with spark plug threads, which led to the spark plugs blowing out and mangling the threads in the cylinder head, which proved as a very costly repair, as it meant you needed to replace the entire head, or oftentimes both heads. Now, this issue has been addressed by Ford by releasing a TSB, which provided instructions on how to repair the plugs. However, due to the fact that this is a labor-intensive process that requires the disassembly and assembly of the top of the engine, it's not guaranteed that every owner actually fixed this. And the worst thing is, you can't even check if the issue has been sorted, because that too would require you to disassemble half the engine, which is not cost-effective for a vehicle that costs a couple of grand. Additionally, the second generation of this engine, which has been produced from 2004 to 2014, is even worse because, apart from not fixing the issues, it also introduced an all-new one: sludge and debris buildup. This leads to the oil passages being clogged up, especially in the cylinder heads, which could starve the engine of oil, reduce lubrication, and lead to a total failure of the engine. Plus, the second generation of the Triton has been known to drink oil like crazy, which, once again, from an engine of this size is certainly not going to be cheap. Essentially, if you're after a cheap run of the mill truck, we'd argue against looking at a 5.4-liter Triton-powered one, as these are, by all accounts, endless money pits that will never return your investment. But as much as we'd like to point you to some of its other American alternatives, we can't. Take, for example, the Ram 1500's 4.7-liter V8. This engine, which is the infamous Chrysler PowerTech V8, has also been met with a great many issues. First, considering how big this engine is, you'd really expect it to be more powerful. The first generation, which was in production until 2008, produced a max output of less than 250 horsepower, which is just abysmal. This engine was also known for its terrible fuel economy, especially around town, with most owners complaining that it doesn't even return 15 miles per gallon. Open road economy is a bit better, clocking in at around 20 on a good day. However, that just isn't enough considering how weak it is. Furthermore, it's not even a particularly reliable engine to begin with. Don't get us wrong, it's not as bad as the Triton, but considering the fact how much worse it is compared to Ford's engine performance-wise, we'd expect it to be properly bulletproof. Instead, what you get is an engine that tends to be quite brittle under heat, as once it starts overheating even a tiny bit, it warps the cylinder heads because they're made from aluminum, whereas the block is made of cast iron. The valve seats are also known to drop off the cylinder heads, causing misfires. Speaking of falling off, rocker arms are also known to just go out to buy some milk, never to be seen again. Lifters also tend to become noisy, and while all these issues aren't exactly 100% going to happen, the fact that the engine is so undercooked for such an underpowered lump certainly doesn't warm our bones. Oh, and did we mention that the sludging problem that was present on the Triton appears here too? Seriously, what was the matter with American manufacturers creating too small oil passages? Furthermore, the transmissions weren't exactly good either. The 545 RFE and the 68 RFE are the Achilles heel of 2000's Ram pickup trucks, as they were one of the key contributors to the abysmal towing capacity that the truck has. GM wasn't much better in the early 2000s either, as it too had a problem with its Vortec 3000 5.3-liter V8 engine, which was used in a great many of its vehicles, most notably the 2007 to 2012 GMC Sierra and Chevy Silverado. Now, out of all three engines we've mentioned, the 5.3 is probably the best, offering solid fuel economy and pretty good performance. However, it had one massive problem: active fuel management. You see, GM was always trying out shenanigans with their engines, from cylinder deactivation to active fuel management. However, it all began with the Vortec engine. You see, this idiotic feature was designed to save fuel by shutting off cylinders. However, what it managed to do is increase oil consumption drastically. The Vortec 5300 is known for drinking a quart of oil per 1,000 miles, which is unbelievable. And the best part is that this is exactly how GM intended it to function, which makes this generation of AFM pure comedy gold. Additionally, the AFM system itself was prone to failure. The lifters would oftentimes start ticking, at which point all you could do was say your prayers and farewells to the engine. Soon after the ticking starts, the engine would produce a noisy clack and just decide to cease to exist. As a result, many owners decided to simply delete it in favor of much more conventional lifter design, which reduced both oil consumption and increased the reliability of the engine. And while you might be sad because you would be losing your precious MPG savings, the truth is that all this added complexity and numerous failure points resulted in only 5 to 7% MPG increase, and that's on a good day. Frankly, not worth it. That said, because the AFM can be removed and because performance is decent, we'd argue that this unit can be an okay workhorse if you drop enough money in it. Or, better yet, if the previous owner already removed the AFM for you. But gas engines aren't even the worst ones you can come up against, as diesels, at least in the US, are drastically more problematic on average. In fact, many modern diesels are just best left untouched, and this includes the 3.0-liter EcoDiesel V6, the 3.0-liter PowerStroke V6, and the 3.0-liter Duramax diesel, all of which have been used in the big 3 half-ton trucks. Don't get us wrong, we love ourselves a good diesel. However, a 3.0-liter engine is just going to be overstrained for a utility truck. You see, diesel engines, much unlike gasoline versions, have a myriad of systems and parts to reduce pollution. Diesel particle filters, EGR valves, more advanced catalytic converters, you name it, and it's there. All of these are both extremely expensive to fix, and if not tended correctly, they're also extremely unsafe. For example, a clogged-up DPF can eventually melt, which could lead to the entire vehicle going up in flames, and that's certainly not something you want to see with your expensive truck, is it? Additionally, the fuel injector system is far more complex than what's used in most modern-day gas cars, and it's far easier to malfunction, all while being drastically more expensive to make. And while yes, you do get unparalleled levels of torque and exceptional MPG, everything you save will go to maintenance and repairs, which is going to be a much more frequent occurrence than with traditional gasoline engines. Out of all of these, the eco-diesel and the Power Stroke also have a problem of being very unrefined, courtesy of the fact that they're both V6 engines and not inline six. This makes them more complicated to produce, drastically more tedious to maintain, and introduces more failure points, all at the veil of a more compact overall size. The Power Stroke is also the same unit used in Peugeots, Jaguars, and Land Rovers in the past, and this engine is colloquially known as one of the worst diesel engines used in them. Its crankshaft tends to snap, especially under heavy loads and pressures, and this issue is prominent on vehicles that are driven without being allowed to heat up properly in place. Now, if we were to choose the absolute worst of the bunch, we'd have to go with the 3.0 eco-diesel from the Ram 1500. This unit has been sourced from Jeep's products, which means that it isn't made by Cummins. Instead, it's made by VM Motori, an Italian engine manufacturer. And while they most certainly do know how to make a good powertrain, the 3.0-liter turbo diesel six-cylinder most certainly isn't one. This engine is much more at home with European road cars rather than American trucks, as it is economical, more performance than utility-oriented, and generally much pickier when it comes down to maintenance and the way it's being used. That's why it's generally very positively regarded in vehicles like the Maserati Ghibli and the final generation of the Maserati Quattroporte. In the Ram 1500, though, it's had more than a couple of headaches, which, apart from the usual set of problems we've previously mentioned, includes timing chain issues, camshaft gears slipping, oil cooler failing, and many more. Yeah, just best to stay away from this unit. The Duramax is, by far, the best of the bunch, and that's one of the key reasons why it's still being offered to this day, while the other two are discontinued. However, honestly, we find it also to be not worth the hassle, as despite offering better MPG, fantastic torque, and solid levels of power, it can tow the same amount of weight, which is 13,300 pounds, as the 6.2-liter V8 Ecotec engine. And while that engine has its own small gripes and issues, it is by far the better choice of the two when it comes down to long-term usage, and especially when talking about buying one second-hand. But these aren't even the worst diesels you can buy. Oh no, if you're looking for the most problematic diesel, then might we suggest you look at, or better yet, completely avoid the 6.0-liter Power Stroke V8. This engine is just a disaster through and through. From a design perspective, the 6.0 Power Stroke just feels like a complete paradox on every possible level. Let's first start with the fuel injection system. The control module is supposed to control the oil solenoids. This module, from a pure logical perspective, should be located away from immense heat to keep it cool and not melt down and interfere with the wiring and plastics. So, where did Ford put it? Directly into the frying pan, on the valve cover, which not only radiates heat, but also vibrates quite a lot, which leads to the module failing constantly and without any prior notice. This leads to the engine failing to start completely, running very roughly due to the glow plugs getting too strong of a current and so on. And while this issue isn't the most expensive or the most problematic one to fix, the frequency of it happening surely is a G. Apart from that, the injectors are also known for failing, and so is the high-pressure fuel pump. And those two things are amongst most expensive things to fix on a diesel truck. Well, that and the turbo, which, as you might have deduced by now, also tends to fail prematurely. Additionally, the oil cooler also tends to fail, which leads to it mixing oil with the coolant, thus leading to the engine overheating, increasing friction and stress, all while also having much poorer lubrication. This eventually breaks the pistons and cylinders and leads to the crankshaft bending or breaking if not tended correctly. A complete engine failure, if you will. And if none of these issues are enough for you, then how about diesel runaway? This is a problem with all diesel engines. However, the 6.0 Power Stroke, due to the injector issues it has, and especially due to the turbocharger prematurely failing, is practically expected to fail, especially now, 20 years after its heyday. And, to make matters worse, its successor, the 6.4-liter Power Stroke, isn't much better either. It dilutes oil, has all kinds of coolant and radiator issues, and many other problems that just makes it not worth to purchase. That said, some of you might be tempted to say goodbye to diesels and say hello to the future, which are hybrids. After all, they provide similar levels of torque, similar levels of fuel economy, while utilizing better powertrains. So it's a win-win, right? Nope. Hybrids are even worse. You see, there are only two proper hybrid trucks in the half-ton segment. Those are the F-150 hybrid and the Tundra hybrid, and both are just plain and simple terrible. The F-150 hybrid uses the 3.5-liter EcoBoost, which is far from a bad unit. However, the hybrid powertrain produces way too much torque on the axle that stresses it out quite rapidly and leads to it being broken far more easily. Additionally, it's not like you get a lot when it comes down to MPG and performance. First, the performance of the F-150 Power Boost, despite the added torque, is worse than the non-hybrid. This is because of the added weight, as well as the added straining to the axle, leaving the F-150 Power Boost quite limited compared to the Coyote Vi-8 or the non-hybrid 3.5-liter. As for MPG, EPA claims that the truck will return 24 MPG combined, which would be impressive if it were true. However, it unfortunately isn't, and many owners and reviewers, amongst which is Edmunds too, have noted that the truck averages over 5 MPG less than what is promised, which is a drastic drop. As a result of this, the Ford F-150 Power Boost has ranked as the least reliable vehicle according to Consumer Reports not once, not twice, but 3 consecutive years in a row. Now, in the real world, we wouldn't exactly call it the worst of the worst, but because over 300,000 vehicles have shared around 20 different failure points, it's easy to see why it got such an abysmal rating. However, in our opinion, the 3.4-liter Tundra iForce Max is much worse than the Power Boost because it literally just copied Ford's idea of how a hybrid truck should look like. This means that most of the issues that arise from using a hybrid return for the Tundra, however, unlike the F-150, which utilizes a relatively reliable engine, the Tundra uses an engine that we've already established is not exactly good for this line of work. It also isn't helped by the fact that the Tundra, with the hybrid, can tow only 11,450 pounds, which isn't exactly good, is it? However, there is another hybrid truck that must make it on the list, and that's the Ford Maverick Hybrid. You see, this compact pickup truck utilizes the same engine as the Ford Escape, meaning that you will be getting a 2.5-liter Atkinson cycle engine. Now, this wouldn't be that big of a deal. However, the fact that it's mated to a CVT makes it quite impotent when it comes down to performance, towing, or comfort. Heck, the Maverick Hybrid can only tow 1,500 pounds in its standard form, expandable to only 2,500 pounds, which is just abysmal, especially when compared to the Hyundai Santa Cruz, which starts from 3,500 pounds. Now, sure, this hybrid is exceptionally frugal, returning up to 42 miles per gallon. However, it only produces 191 horsepower, and it has no guts when it comes down to power delivery, making it rather useless if you intend to use the Maverick for anything other than city commutes. In addition to that, this engine also had a myriad of issues on the pre-facelift Maverick, to the point that it could jeopardize your life. First in line is the well-known fire risk of the Maverick. The engine fails prematurely due to the cylinder head cracking. This leads to fuel vapors escaping the engine, which potentially leads to fires when they contact the exhaust manifold. Now, an engine fire is a very concerning thing. However, what's a bigger problem here is the fact that we're talking about a hybrid. Batteries are combustible, and they can lead to much bigger and much longer and harder to control fires than just fuel, which makes them far more dangerous. And since the battery is positioned under the cabin, it means that injury and potentially fatal outcomes are more likely than not. And while yes, this issue has been recalled last year, there already was one unsuccessful recall concerning it, and not everyone who owns the Maverick decided to bring it to shop. Also, you're just better off avoiding the Maverick hybrid altogether, as, apart from the engine issue, the truck itself has been flawed by rapidly failing dampers, problems with the braking system, jerking, software issues, and many more. You're just better off with the EcoBoost, even though you will be sacrificing a lot of MPG. The facelift has seemingly sorted out these issues. However, it is far too expensive to be a sensible purchase, and with the tariffs in place, it's sure to become even pricier. Essentially, despite many of these models and engines being made and sold by the millions, especially those 2000 models, which might seem like a bargain nowadays, there is a reason to avoid most of them. There is a myriad of better alternatives, ranging from new powertrains to dinosaurs that will offer you better performance, better reliability, and a greater ownership experience than these ones. And if you'd like to learn more about them, be sure to check out this video.